Thank you, Tarek, for that very nice, very generous introduction. I'm speaking, of course, privately, and as Hicham and Alaoui. Thank you for that bio, and no, I'm not embarrassed. And I am precisely early because I am a graduate professor. In order to respect punctuality and to respect my time limit, I can't look back because it will be rather impolite to everyone in the audience. I kept my watch here, so with your permission, to everyone, I believe my talk is around 35 to 40 minutes. Although I must say, this is a very special and emotional talk because it is a theme I've been grappling with and trying to sort out in my head for the past 10 years. What it means to be an Arab, what does Oruba mean in a changing moment. And it's introspection, but with a lot of flashbacks, with a lot of moments that I have lived as a practitioner, as I have lived in Morocco, elsewhere, sometimes in the corridors of power, sometimes directly, unexpectedly, as a witness to many of these tumultuous events that have happened. So sorting this out is an ongoing effort, and it's certainly not the definitive take, but I will submit to you some of my ideas and some of my thoughts and convictions about this theme. Today we're living in a time of unprecedented upheaval, as you see in the Arab world, in which centrifugal forces of violence and chaos are, of course, dividing Arab societies and states. It is easy to assume for any one of us who's observing innocently these events to say that the region's fate is one of fragmentation and chaos, and that states will ultimately divide and societies will tear apart. Yet at the same time, there's something vital, and it's important to remember there is something uniquely unifying about these events that we're experiencing today. We are living in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. It's the Arab Spring in the singular, not in the plural, because it invokes and it taps into a common experience that is to Arabs have absorbed it since 2011, 2012. That experience was defined, of course, by mobilization, change, possibility of democracy that was unimaginable for the past generations. Most of all, this experience is ongoing because, as we all know, historical experiences take a long time to deploy and to unfold, and they do so in the most unexpected ways. In this lecture, I want to explore these notions of Arabness and Arab unity in both their historical and contemporary context, and advance the idea that it can only be realized through genuine democratization. And this invokes the question today then, can Arab unity exist in a time of fragmentation and conflict? The notion of unifying all Arabs may be a fiction, but we have to realize that it has been a fiction that has, for which many projects and many endeavors and undertakings have in fact existed. The rationale behind this, of course, lies in complementarity and collectivity, as the Arab countries can be thought of as interlocking blocks of the same unit. But first, and most importantly, states suffer from a major structural weakness that could be ameliorated through greater integration with one another. The region encompasses, as you know, great variety in population size, from Egypt with 100 million souls to Bahrain with only 1 million, with states having enormous resources in the form of oil and gas, and others having no geological endowment. Some Arab countries will struggle with universalizing literacy and education, while others burst with human capital and job-seeking citizens that are very articulate in today's world. Some have reaped the bounties, of course, of agricultural production and export to the world. Others are totally dependent on food imports. Second, regional integration can bring concrete collective payoffs that will be shared indivisibly by all Arabs. These payoffs can be economic, through the creation of a common market that would facilitate the circulation of people, of funds, and that would, of course, help with circulation of labor and free trade, a little bit or a lot like the European Union has benefited. These payoffs can also take the form of inducing Arab governments towards more cooperation and especially reducing conflicts and the tendency towards violence. They can also resolve common regional difficulties such as water shortages, environmental problems, the protection of minorities, why not the control of the diffusion of weapons of mass destruction, and also help address refugees and displaced persons. Nevertheless, we must recognize that there are deep problems in front of us. First, economically, Arab countries are poorly connected to one another in terms of trade flows, in terms of investments and infrastructural linkages. And also there's the distorting effects of oil rates, which continue to inject violence and a tendency towards adventurism in the region. Secondly, politically, most Arab states remain under the control of sultans. And here by sultans, I loosely translate authoritarian regime, whether personalistic, based on traditional monarchies or on dominating parties. Finally, the region's exposure to waves of conflicts have also introduced traumatic geopolitical cleavages. In its last manifestation, this ongoing conflict is manifested by what we can call the Arab Civil War. And it pits two contradictory coalitions against one another. One is, of course, the Sunni coalition, and the other is the Shiite coalition. Very briefly, the Sunni coalition is a complex coalition and very fractured coalition, and is formed by sultans, autocrats, authoritarian regimes, Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and other movements, and of course Salafi jihadi movements, quintessential example being the Islamic State. Now, by contrast, of course, the Shia coalition is perhaps more heterogeneous, but it is more unified, and it is represented by Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq, the Yemeni Houthis. Of course, these are clumsy categories, but because we refer to them all the time, it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and these coalitions have grown more and more identifiable in their conflict against one another. Now, just one word about the Sunni coalition. It is very fractured, and that's one of its problems. Sultans and the Brotherhood and the organizations, the Islamist organizations, the mainstream Islamist organizations, both oppose jihadis, but within that binomial, they oppose each other. With Brotherhood, with the Islamist movements predicated upon mass sovereignty defined by popular adherence to Islam. On the contrary, the traditional sultans see themselves as being the only depositaries of Islam and the only interpreters of Islam, which they use to retain popular sovereignty. Very lately, another complexity has been introduced by what has become the Saudi and the Qatari rift, which has burst in the open a few months back, and it has further splintered that coalition. So given all these obstacles, the Arab states will need to find an indigenous way towards integration, and they simply cannot replicate the European model. It will have to be something very, very local to them, and that emerge within their fabric and within their world. In Europe, just a very brief reminder, destruction by total warfare catalyzed economic and ultimately political integration. European reindustrialization after World War II conjoined material and democratic advancement for economic advancement and progress spilled into the political realm, thereby consolidating democracy. However, we do not dare to think what kind of more destruction, what kind of destruction and added violence we would need to see for something like that to gain traction in our region. Now, very briefly, before I tackle this issue of democratization and the Arab Spring, I would like to talk about the history of Arab integration. To understand the future of integration, we of course have to understand its past. And there is a basic, unshakable premise here from which everybody departs. The natural conditions of Arabs is one of cultural affinity, because shared linguistic, geographic, and historical origins endow us with a disposition, indeed a will, to live together under a single holistic civilizational unit. In modern times, this notion emerged in the twilight of the Ottoman Empire and resulted in the ideology of nationalism, also pan-Arabism. Such an idea was carried forth by a new generation of intellectuals and thinkers, which have put down the intellectual foundations for it, and it came of age in the heyday of European domination in the Middle East. At its zenith, pan-Arabism, of course, came after World War II and was represented or embodied by the regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser and Jamal Abdel Nasser himself. And the first effort to systematically tie all the Arab countries together in a forum, intergovernmental forum, was, of course, the Arab League. Pan-Arabism, of course, as you all know, declined precipitously after the cataclysmic defeat of 1967, which saw the Arab armies defeated in the battlefield. But still, that potent memory is still very much alive, and it reverberates in Arab states today. But one legacy of Arab nationalists, very briefly, is the attempt to create political unifications and attempts that ultimately failed. Some of these were, of course, the Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria, the merger, the Hashemite and Iraqi merger in 1958, and the association of Egypt, Sudan, and Libya in 1972. Of course, the Arab world did not live in a vacuum. It did not live in a parallel universe, and it was influenced and penetrated by other phenomena that were happening in the world, and namely, most importantly, perhaps, was the Cold War. So, as early as the 70s, you saw conflicts between Morocco and Algeria that stemmed all the way back since the beginning of independence, but these now were full-blown, and they centered around what we in Morocco call the Sahara, what Algerians call an independent entity. You saw also, of course, the conflict in 1970, the Black September, opposing the Hashemite monarchy and the Palestinians, and of course there was the embargo on Egypt due to its unilateral accords or agreements it signed for peace with Israel. So the Arab world witnessed after that, new multilateral efforts to tie states together, more smaller, more modest. Of these, only one is really worthwhile mentioning is the GCC, the Cooperation Council for the Gulf, and even now it's undergoing a crisis, as you all know. The 1990 Gulf War marked the definitive end of pan-Arabism. The War of '67 ended, was a major defeat, but still there was some residual effect of that whole ideology and that whole philosophy until, I would say, the Gulf War in 1990. And here, the problem, of course, was due to a simple fact. It was not only a country, an Arab country, aggressing another Arab country which it recognized and with which it had diplomatic relationships, namely Iraq aggressing Kuwait, but it was a bizarre situation in which most of the Arab countries, except the Gulf Wars, cheered that annexation and that occupation, and literally were on the side of this violation of international law. And to add insult to injury to Arab nationalism, the way to reverse, or the way the occupation of Kuwait was reversed, was by calling or by inviting the West, spearheaded by the United States, which now not only was a hegemon in the region, but now had troops and bases in the heart of the Arab land, in the heart of the holy places, namely Saudi Arabia. And that hegemony, after taking root locally in the peninsula, then engaged in the war in 2003 against Iraq to overthrow Saddam. At least this is how the narrative was seen by Gulf states and by most Arabs. While Saddam's defeat was the final nail in the coffin of Arab nationalism, we must understand also that Islamism had supplanted Arab nationalism long before, and now it carried the banner for regional resistance against the West. So chronologically, although the Arab nationalism, as we know, it comes before Islamism, we have to know that these two are imbricated, are very linked together by this idea which is fundamental to them, which is the resistance to the West. And Just let me give you a brief example to show this imbrication. I think it's very important that everyone keeps this in mind. So, one of the ideological forefathers of Arab nationalism was Michel Aflaq and the Ba'ath, which was, if you will, the second leg of Arab nationalism, and which basically ran or held Syria and Iraq together. Michel Aflaq in 1943, and I quote here, said, "Europe is as fearful of Islam today as she has been in the past. She now knows that the strength of Islam, which in the past expressed that of the Arabs, has been reborn and has appeared in a new form, in Arab nationalism. The nationalists will find themselves the only defenders of true Islam, and they will have to create in it new meaning if they are determined to preserve good reason for the survival of the Arab nation." So inversely, when Islamism rose to prominence, it was now new Islamist groups within the form of non-state actors or state themselves that came to the defense of this idea. And after the cataclysmic defeat of 1967, it was King Faisal and Saudi Arabia who, in the West and elsewhere, we could say represented a theocratic state, came to the rescue of this idea of Arab nationalism by imposing his embargo in 1973, demanding finally a final and a peaceful solution and a just solution to the Palestinian-Israeli problem. A decade later, when new Islamist groups like Hezbollah coalesced and came into action, both the rhetoric and symbolism of Arab unity played a major role. Upon its founding, for instance, they liberated the lands or engaged in a war of liberation in the name of the recuperation of Arab lands, and Jerusalem also was in their sights, and its liberation was to be achieved in the name of all Arabs. I would urge you to see all the rhetoric of Hezbollah and of Hassan Nasrallah, and you will see that this theme is extremely powerful. Elements of Arab nationalism, I must say, still resonate even in the most abject and appalling circumstances today. The Islamic State, Daesh, understood well the symbolic power of its pledge to destroy the colonial boundaries, which were a legacy of Sykes-Picot agreement, which historically marked the betrayal of the West promises for a single Arab nation. Now, why did nationalism in this form fail? I think in retrospect, the problem of Arab nationalism as an ideological vector for Arab unity lay not only in the failure and the shortcomings of its strategies to unify states, but rather in its ideational origin. How is that? Well, this is what I think. From the beginning, its inception, Pan-Arabism was deeply influenced by German Romantic nationalism. Thought that enshrined cultural purity and instilled an exclusionary belief of superiority. As a result, Pan-Arabism was unwilling and unable to integrate many other communities as equals. They were unable to integrate the Jews, the Berbers, the Kurds, and the Christians as equals in building this common project. And furthermore, nationalism too easily accommodated authoritarianism, giving the sultans, meaning autocratic states, a free hand and a blank check. And the slogan of the era, if there was one slogan that best encapsulates this idea, was "La صوت يعلى فوق صوت المعركة," meaning there will be no voice of a higher decibel level than the noise of the battlefield, which is a confrontation with Israel. The economics, if we see why this has failed, now perhaps there may be another answer. Perhaps the answer is economics. This brings us to the material logic. Can the Arab world collective need for economic development in a time of crisis encourage this Arab regional integration? Until recently, it was difficult to envision greater economic unity given the toxic effects of hydrocarbon rents. Political scientists have long debated and long discussed the negative repercussions or the negative effects of rents, from the purchase of acquiescence to the establishment of universal welfarism and subsidies. In a sense, the availability of easy money weakens society. It weakens a national or Arab bourgeoisie that is supposed to be the motor for economic integration, and it also weakens any class consciousness, which also is a driving force for economic change and for democratization. On a regional level, hydrocarbon rents also were disruptive, for they encourage inventorist interventions everywhere. We tend to think that when oil rents go down, that's when regimes have trouble. We're looking at economic problems, at stress and tension in society. It's rather the contrary. When oil rents go down, this is when the sound questions come up to the surface. And when rents come up, this is when everybody finds his coffers full and everybody embarks on his own adventure, creating tension in the region. So, what is the prospect? What is the outlook on the future of rents? I'm not an economist, but after lengthy reading and lengthy scrutiny, there seems to be this notion that is taking root today that the era of rents is on the decline. And this could introduce monumental changes in the regional landscape. We're living in an era of oversupply, basically, in that the volume of technically recoverable oil will far exceed the demand of oil. While the growing middle class in India and China will stimulate demand, other factors will mitigate and will dampen demand, like the constraints imposed by global climate change, as well as technological advances in basic goods. The most noticeable or spectacular one we as normal people see every day are, I think, automobiles, hybrids, electric stuff. This is really very new. So another problem also for oil production is the introduction of shale oil, which has transformed global price mechanism, because unlike conventional oil, its production is rapid and can come online very fast. So further, the financial value of hydrocarbons is no longer merely in its upstream. That is, it's not only at the extraction level at the well. When most of the action happened at the well, this is when states had the most clout. When things move away to the market, to the derivatives, to the downstream product, this is when the state loses its clout and loses its comparative advantage. And here, of course, by downstream, I mean transformation into secondary products like petrochemicals and non-combustible plastics. In essence, the energy market has globalized. Hydrocarbon supplies that come online anywhere, regardless of origin, can be traded openly to buyers across the world, which has tilted influence away from states and given more power to the private actors. So in essence, we can say that OPEC is now not so much a price maker, but a price taker. Because oil prices are unlikely to recover to historical highs, the previously unassailable reservoirs of hydrocarbons have become, for all these states, they become stranded assets, meaning that they cost much more to recuperate, to extract, and the margins in selling them becomes, of course, dwindled. Now, the decline of hydrocarbon rentier economy is a real crisis, but it does open the space for opportunities of Arab integration efforts that focus upon major economic diversification. Indeed, we visualize the Arab world as a coherent economic bloc that we already see key value-added sectors in different places. It includes tourism, it includes agriculture, and tourism, for example, in Tunisia, when they're not busy deporting people. In Tunisia, and for example, steel and vehicles in Turkey, or textiles and pharmaceuticals in Jordan. One last word on the political prerequisites of regional integration before we move to the Arab Spring and how that may pave the way to more integration. All told then, economic barriers and opportunities show that it remains extremely difficult for most Arab regimes to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term payoffs and investments. What further makes this integration project difficult is that there's not a climate in which a consensual Arab leader emerges. In the past, it was Egypt. If you look at Europe, it was the binomial France and Germany. Here, Egypt, which played this historical role, is no longer the political vanguard and not the cultural center. Saudi Arabia has a preponderance of wealth, but it cannot translate that wealth into pan-Arab appeal, into what we would call simply soft power. However, the Arab world at the same time cannot turn to outside actors for the solution. The European Union can help integration in the Maghreb, and it can help with integration elsewhere around the Mediterranean. However, the past legacies and histories of colonialism inject a fair dose of caution in this because of the baggage that comes with leadership roles and that is invoked by historical legacies of colonialism. Today, major powers also like the US, the UK, France, still prefer dealing with Arab states for strategic reasons on individual basis. The solution is neither in Russia nor in China as well, for the same reasons. And the ambitious China Belt and Road Initiative, which is a modern reformulation of the old Silk Road, promises only to supplant or replace one hegemony by another. So today, most Arab regimes cannot enter a region-wide pact without first reformulating their national pact with their citizenry. But again, there are a lot of obstacles because to devolve your power for a collective gain, you must be able to let go. You must be able to sacrifice your coalition, which props you up in power. And this is the fundamental reason why these projects simply do not succeed unless there is a democratic context. And as we've seen, the most successful experiments in these deep regional integration, especially in the economic sense, all involve consolidated democracies, whether in the EU or NAFTA. Now, there's another factor that could have helped with integration, namely the existence of fundamental security threats, as the threat in Europe of a resurgence of war after two world wars. That has really pushed actors in Europe to sit together and to imagine this integration. Well, that threat, despite or in spite of all the volatility that exists in the Middle East, is basically neutralized because of the presence of Western forces and because of the presence of a security architecture that deeply penetrates the Arab world and that shields the region from any shocks, whether it be the Gulf War or the Syrian crisis. And of course, the reason for that was the protection of oil. So that basically is not an impetus that is present in our region. And hence, the impetus for future regional integration in the Arab world, thus, will be domestic political change. It transforms and pluralizes states everywhere. This will only come with future waves of the Arab Spring, which brings us to democratization in the region. I think we will all agree that the Arab Spring in its present phase has imploded, and it's either created failed states, has either created violence and displacement, or basically has installed autocratic regimes that have come back to power with more vehemence and more coercion. However, there will be future waves because the underlying conditions of the Arab world have not radically changed. Youth demography, diffusion culture, liberation technology or social media, decrease of the importance of parties and of ideologies, unresponsive governments, weak levels of services and goods are all factors that render the situation or the status quo very difficult to attain. And the dignity that was initially imposed from above by the Pan-Arabism has now exploded from below and diffused everywhere. This illustrates that the impulse towards cultural unity is still very much alive in the Arab world. Before, dignity, and if you remember in the Nasserist project, dignity came from above. We will only recuperate dignity if we free ourselves from the hegemony of the West, and the exemplification of that, which is in the discourse of Arab Pan-Arabism, Israel. And while the mukhabarat of different countries in that period of time stabs themselves in the back because everybody was plotting against everyone else, there were still structures of cooperation, or security cooperation, in which worked together, basically to clobber any dissenting voices. And that was the way, that was the pact between everybody to achieve dignity. Well, fair enough. Dignity never left or never exited, but now it was reappropriated by the people, and the people are saying, this is not going to be something that's going to be imposed from above. This can only come through self-determination and through emancipation from below. And it is important to recall here a little bit what our earlier moment of unity, this Arab Spring, why it failed. Very briefly, the victory of Islamists in elections is not what made the Arab Spring fail. This is an Orientalist trope. It's not Islamists that made this fail. What made this fail is the inability of the youth movements and the democratic movements that came out in the street, whether in Cairo, whether in Egypt, whether in Casablanca, whether anywhere else, that came out demanding change, but they did not organize, they did not craft the strategic alliances and engage in the right politics to take the helm of a state that was going rudderless. And they, as a result, they could not shield the acquired gains from the ravages of geopolitics, which was going to re-emerge into the scene and constitute the counter-revolution. After the first waves of mass protests that rocked the region, the counter-revolution began essentially in Bahrain with the suppression of the popular uprising. And here, what you had is basically a Sunni coalition standing behind the Bahraini state. That quickly morphed into a parallel or into a mirror image in Syria, where it was a Shia regime and a Shia coalition resisting change. And this was the entry point into a confrontation, a geopolitical confrontation that had become confessional. In this way, counter-revolution and sectarian conflict became one of the same. Sunni rivalry was the pretext for the events in Bahrain, but now it defines the dynamics elsewhere. Yet the Sunni counter-revolution has already lost, in my opinion. It cannot turn back the clock. It cannot create an alternative, an attractive alternative. Syria may be a failed state, but it is a state nonetheless still under the control of Assad's regime. There is now a contiguous geography and corridor going from Iran through Iraq, all the way through Syria to the Mediterranean and extending down to Lebanon. And at the same time, the intervention in Yemen has turned into a humanitarian crisis. The Saudi or the Sunni Arab camp has become even more repressive to civil society as a result of this tension and democratic activists. However, the counter-revolutionaries will continue pouring resources into lost conflicts, believing they can win. This has become an inescapable spiral. Every time you go into an adventure because you feel threatened, because you feel there's a gain, you lose, you have to double down, as in gambling. You strategically are gambling. You're doubling down and going to the next crisis. And very briefly, you have two examples. I'm just going to name two examples here. Egypt. The counter-revolutionary coalition invited itself to help or to assist the coup in Egypt. As a result, Egypt and Sisi felt themselves threatened by what was happening in Libya through different accords, which were essentially going to empower Islamists, moderate Islamists, and it has taken the Gulf coalition and the Sunni coalition into an adventure again in Libya. The same thing can be said about Yemen. Yemen was a case where the intervention was supposed to thwart or abort the encirclement of Saudi Arabia by the Houthis. Intervention quickly became a quagmire and became unwinnable. So then we started exploring political solutions. Political solutions meant empowering political actors, and as soon as these political actors reached a certain critical mass, then we've become dividing again the landscape and dividing the south again and creating another political problem in Yemen, namely in the south. Not even mentioning the humanitarian crisis, which has been labeled by the UN and by many observers as a case of crimes against humanity or war crimes. So these spirals are becoming inescapable to the degree that I see, and this is a personal prediction, I may be completely wrong and off the mark, to the sense that I see it fundamentally shifting even the old alliance. There will be a next war. This war will involve, again, Israel and Hezbollah, and because of its fear from Iran, Saudi Arabia and the Sunni coalition will implicitly, if not explicitly support Israel. And that is fraught, but it is full of dangers. And we've already seen signs of this. I have been struck and I have been alarmed, probably not the word, but I have been reinforced in my conviction by watching the speech of the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia at the UN, where he said, we cannot be held hostage anymore to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's no longer an Arab conflict, it's a Palestinian conflict. I say no longer an Arab because 5 years before it was Saudi Arabia that sponsored a peace plan that called the conflict the Arab-Israeli conflict. So with the stroke of a pen, he basically scrapped away 20 years and decades of established foreign policy. So that is something. So this is again a manifestation of doubling down. So these spirals. Now, if we read our literature as astute observers of international relations and politics, we can see that this carves out the possibility of external shocks. As with Greece in 1970s, and as with Argentina in 1980s, authoritarian states that lose in international legitimacy in the international realm can find themselves challenged and contested at home. So this is maybe something we have to be alerted to and watch very carefully. Maybe the Arab Spring will come once again when it comes in its own wave through this mechanism. This will be its conflict. Failure being challenged irreversibly in the international sphere. In parallel, there are also monumentous pressures building up within the heart of the Sunni counter-revolutionary bloc. In Saudi Arabia, generational change has produced a new wave of conservative elites who believe that they can foreclose demands, or at least displace the pressure by reform, by liberalizing the economic arena and providing social quick fixes, such as allowing women to drive or allowing cinemas. Now, we are all here in this room, and I suppose we are all for women driving, we are all for free entertainment, but we ought to be careful in the way these are used as substitutes for political reform. That's what I wanted to say. So this model, if it takes root and is taking shape, is a crude approximation of the Chinese model, but it's not a solution. It merely replaces one problem with another. Moreover, it risks antagonizing large conservative sectors of society without fully harnessing the loyalty and the support of social forces that can be gained from emancipation and that will shield and protect the states of any negative development or spiral into a populist regime. Further, traditional mechanisms of consensus within these societies, such as elite dialogue or elite bargain, have been eliminated leaving these regimes rigid. This is precisely how the Iranian Revolution erupted. Further, outside the Gulf, I think the Maghreb countries are, by virtue of geography and history, shielded from the counter-revolutionary and sectarian conflict and represent the best chance for achieving a democratic breakthrough. Here, democracy is certainly not on the agenda, whether in Algeria or Tunisia. It's not the priority. Today, the priority is order, stability, and economic growth. But through an unintended consequences and by a fortuitous mechanism, because social demands are so pressing and powerful, it is possible to imagine a democratic breakthrough due to an imposition of sorts. Before coming to Morocco and Tunisia, a brief word on Tunisia. Tunisia remains the brightest legacy, of course, of the Arab world in terms of democratic transition. An electoral democracy still has to consolidate. It's not consolidated. It's still an electoral democracy, has crossed the threshold, but consolidation has yet to happen, meaning forms of horizontal accountability and oversight and the proper functioning of the judiciary and the proper functioning of all institutions. But it is a successful story of successful pacting between Islamists and secularists. The problem with this pacting is that now it's frozen. We have the democracy of the Sheikhain, meaning the democracy of Rashid al-Ghannouchi and of his partner in the bargaining process, Majid Qaid Sibsi. And like all pactings, the risk of a frozen pact that basically doesn't move forward and freezes out everybody else is more and more prevalent and more visible. So the last chapter of this story is still unwritten, but these are some of the dangers. And we're seeing this with the return of the old regime figures back into decision-making positions, and basically the impasse with all the efforts around transitional justice. By contrast, Algeria and Morocco, my country, are cases of political systems that have reached a stage of liberalized autocracy, but through different pathways. For the Moroccan monarchy, it took 20 years to enter into liberalization and bargaining, pluralism curtailed nonetheless, but pluralism or the foundations of pluralism. In Algeria, that came immediately after the civil war, where the regime needed to get out of an existential crisis. For Algeria, the challenge is one of succession, of course. After President Bouteflika passes away, how the different components in that regime will reconfigure and bargain a new arrangement remains to be seen. And these elements are the security apparatus with the military, the business establishment, and of course the what's around the executive. And in Morocco, the current challenges, of course, lies in the Rif and how that crisis will play out. The Rif is both an old and a new problem. It's an old problem because the central authority has deliberately marginalized these regions in the 60s and 70s. And because they were restless, because they were basically contested the authority of the center, and they were deliberately marginalized. In the last 15 years, the state has done tremendous efforts to break that impasse and to bring in the Rif into the landscape of development. However, these efforts were ad hoc and they were weak institutionally, and as a result, because they were discretionary, they did not solve the years of crisis. The Rif movement is not a secessionist movement. It is not the essential expression of the Rifian character. It is a modern confrontation of marginalized citizens against a political system that they see as unjust, not having delivered their rights. So the problem for the Moroccan state today, unlike the past one, it's not ideological. These groups are not ideological. They're not Islamists, they're not socialists, and they do not fall into ready-made categories. It is an agile movement and does not fit into existing categories, as I just said. It builds on the legacy of it's different, but builds on the legacy of the Moroccan Spring February 20 movement, which took on the stage because it contests the ways in which the priorities of economic development that were directed or attributed to the region. It also contests the instrumentalization of religion. So all the slogans you see in February 20 movement are reappropriated and reformulated in the discourse of the Rifin activists. There is also an economic basis or specificity to this movement, namely the fact that because they were marginalized, this is a region that has entered into narcotics and smuggling, and the state allowed that to happen precisely to facilitate, to create some kind of, safety valve for all the tensions. As a result, these networks have been created in which activists, in which people are shielded from the control of the state and have gained some autonomy. Also, it's a region that has known a lot of immigration, and because there has been immigration, there has been a diaspora that's been constituted outside, and there are many transnationalities between this diaspora and the Reef, which is giving the Reef a real resource in resistance to the state. Again, dialogue between the state and the Islam and the Reefi or the Reefin contestation is still open. It is still open, but with all the goodwill that the state can have, and the state has goodwill. These are daunting problems. They cannot be fixed overnight. They will require decades to be fixed. So what's the solution? Maybe the solution is in some form of regional devolution into accelerated centralization in which citizens of that area are allowed to have more prerogatives in terms of managing their affairs. So to sum up all these experiences from across the Arab world, more democracy could be well in the future, yet these processes are open-ended. They are unpredictable, and we still do not know where they will lead. But they will lead somewhere. They will lead to Arab integration for sure. And what I also can say for sure, it is the only pathway to Arab integration. Thank you.